At 18, the council forced her to marry the dying Alpha King in order to save their pack. The forest was silent, save for the whisper of wind through the tall, ancient trees. Mist clung to the ground like a silver veil, hiding the secrets of the pack that had lived there for centuries. The young Omega woman walked slowly along the narrow path, her heart heavy with dread. At 18, she had thought her life would be her own, filled with freedom and quiet purpose. But the council had other plans. Her name was Elara, and she had always been aware of the expectations that came with her status. The Omega were the peacemakers, the mediators, and often the heart of the pack. She had spent years learning about herbs, healing, and diplomacy, hoping to one day help her people without being trapped in the rigid laws of tradition. But tonight, all of that seemed irrelevant. The council's decree echoed in her mind. To save the pack from ruin, she was to marry the Alpha King, a man feared by all for his strength, his cunning, and his cold authority. A man dying of a disease so rare and cruel that even the wisest healers had given up hope. Alara's stomach twisted at the thought. She had never seen the Alpha King, only heard stories. He was a shadow in the minds of her people, a ruler who demanded loyalty and feared betrayal above all else. To marry him was to place herself in a cage she could not escape, and yet, if she refused, her pack would crumble, leaving her people vulnerable to rivals. The path ahead was shrouded in mist, and every step felt heavier than the last. Memories of her childhood flitted through her mind, the lessons from the elders, the quiet smiles of her parents, the warmth of her small room in the Omega quarters. She had always known sacrifice was part of life, but she had never imagined it would demand this much. When she arrived at the edge of the forest, the palace appeared like a dark jewel against the night sky. Its towers reached toward the clouds, sharp and silent, as though daring anyone to approach. Stone gargoyles perched on the balconies, their eyes seeming to follow her as she walked closer. The air smelled of cold stone and distant fires. The palace had always felt alive to the pack, a place where power and history were etched into every wall. Inside, the council waited, their faces drawn and grave. The room was dim, lit only by torches that flickered and cast long shadows on the walls. At the far end, the Alpha King sat, though he was smaller than the legends had described. His hair was streaked with silver, and his eyes, sharp and commanding, were softened by pain. He looked like a man who had carried the weight of the world for too long, yet he was still every bit the ruler everyone feared. "Elara," said the council leader, his voice trembling slightly despite his age. "The pack's survival depends on this union."
"You are strong, intelligent, and wise. We trust you to fulfill this duty."
Elara bowed her head, refusing to meet the Alpha King's gaze. Her voice was small, barely a whisper. "I understand, Council. I will do as you command." The Alpha King's eyes flicked to her then, and for a moment, she felt as though he could see into her soul. There was no warmth there, no mercy, only a quiet curiosity. He had been told she would obey, but perhaps he was wondering if she would resist. "You leave tonight," the council leader continued. "The path is dangerous, and time is short. He has waited long enough for an heir to secure the pack's future."
"You must not delay."
Tonight. She had no time to prepare, no chance to gather courage or consider the consequences. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her like a mountain. She wanted to scream, to run, to flee into the night, but the thought of her pack, of the people who depended on her, stopped her. She walked through the castle gates, the cold stone under her fingers sending shivers up her spine. The halls were silent, echoing with memories of battles, celebrations, and secrets long buried. She could feel the history in every step, the power of rulers past, the whispers of ancestors who had shaped the pack with wisdom and strength. Then she saw him. The Alpha King stood in the shadowed hallway, leaning against the cold stone wall. His eyes met hers, steady and piercing. He did not smile, did not greet her warmly, but there was a weight in his gaze, a mix of curiosity and calculation that made her stomach flutter.
"You are earlier than expected,"
He said, his voice low and controlled, like the rumble of distant thunder. "I wondered if you would come at all." She had not spoken to him before, and now she had to face a man who could command life and death with a glance. "I came because I must," she said softly, though her voice shook. "My pack needs me to." He stepped closer, and she felt the air shift around him. Even weakened by illness, his presence was formidable. The stories had not done justice to the gravity of standing in his presence. She felt small, fragile, yet there was a strange pull she could not explain, as though fate itself had drawn her to this moment. "You understand the role you are stepping into?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. "This is not a game. You will be judged, tested, and you may find that duty is heavier than you expect."
"I understand," she replied, though a part of her wondered if she truly did.
She could not imagine the trials ahead, the secrets she would uncover, or the man she would come to know, not as a ruler to her pack, but as a man bound by his own suffering and pride. For a long moment neither spoke. The only sound was the distant drip of water from the stone walls and the soft wind that moved through the open windows. Then, almost imperceptibly, the Alpha King's expression softened, a flicker of weariness passing over his face. "You are brave," he said quietly. "Braver than most who would be forced into this." Elara's throat tightened. She had never sought bravery. It had simply been thrust upon her. But she could not deny the truth in his words. Courage was no longer a choice. It was a necessity. As night deepened, they moved through the palace together. He showed her her chambers, a room both beautiful and imposing, with high ceilings, heavy curtains, and a view over the mist-covered mountains. She would live here, at his side, and the reality of that fact settled like ice in her veins. When she finally stood at the window, looking out over the forest, she realized she was truly alone. The pack she had known, the life she had imagined, all of it was gone. In its place was a world of power, shadow, and duty, and at the center of it all was the Alpha King, a man whose life hung by a thread and whose secrets would shape her future. A sudden chill ran down her spine. She turned, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that no one else had seen. Fear, not fear of her, but of the future, of what was to come, of the choices that would define both their lives. "Elara," he said, his voice almost a whisper, "there are things you do not yet understand, things that may change everything you think you know about duty, loyalty, and love." Before she could respond, the doors to her chambers creaked open, and a servant hurried in, bowing deeply.
"Your Highness, the Council demands your presence immediately."
"There are urgent matters concerning the rival packs and your marriage." Elara's heart thudded in her chest. She had hoped for a moment to breathe, to gather her courage, but the night offered no reprieve. She glanced at the Alpha King, and for a fleeting second their eyes met in understanding, a silent acknowledgement that the path ahead would be treacherous, yet necessary. As she followed the servant down the winding halls, the castle seemed to close around her. Shadows stretched like fingers, and the air was thick with whispers of the past. She could feel the weight of history pressing down on her, the eyes of ancestors watching her every step. And then, just as they reached the grand hall where the council waited, a distant howl echoed through the night. It was not the howl of a single wolf, but many, strong and urgent, carrying a message of danger, of challenge, of forces beyond her control. The Alpha King's hand brushed against hers, a touchlight yet grounding. She felt a surge of determination she had not known she possessed. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it. For her pack, for herself, and perhaps, in time, for him. The council's chamber loomed ahead, torches flickering against the stone walls, and the Alpha King stepped forward, his strength undeniable, even in weakness. Elara drew a deep breath. Tonight, her life would change forever. She would step into a world of power, fear, and secrets, and nothing would ever be the same again. And as the doors opened, revealing the council's stern faces, Elara knew this was only the beginning. The real challenge, the one that would test her heart, her courage, and her very soul, was waiting inside. The palace at night was alive with whispers. Every corridor, every archway seemed to hum with secrets. Elara walked beside the Alpha King, her steps careful on the cold stone floors. Though he had allowed her to follow him, she felt the weight of countless eyes upon her, watching, judging. Even in silence, the palace seemed aware of her presence. The Alpha King moved with quiet authority, his step steady despite the weakness that had been gnawing at him for months. His silver-streaked hair glimmered faintly in the torchlight, and though his face was pale, his sharp eyes missed nothing. Elara noticed the way servants quickly averted their gaze as he passed, bowing low. Fear, yes, but also respect. Respect he demanded not through kindness, but through the sheer force of his presence. "You will learn quickly," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "This palace is not just stone and wood. It is alive with history, with power. Some of it will help you. Some of it will test you. Be ready for both."
Elara nodded, swallowing the lump of fear in her throat. "I understand, Your Highness." He glanced at her, and for a moment something softened in his expression.
"I do not say that to frighten you. I say it to prepare you. You are clever, but cleverness alone will not protect you here." Their steps echoed down the halls until they reached a grand chamber filled with ancient relics. The walls were lined with portraits of past alphas, stern faces painted in oil, each one seeming to watch her. Weapons hung on racks, some ceremonial, others clearly meant for battle. Candles flickered, casting moving shadows that danced across the floor. "This will be your home," the Alpha King said. "For now, you will learn the ways of the palace, its secrets, and its dangers. You will also learn me, though I warn you, I am not easy to know." Elara's gaze wandered to the windows, where the night sky stretched endlessly. She felt a mix of awe and fear. The palace was magnificent, yes, but it was also a prison. A gilded cage where her life would be dictated not by her choice, but by duty. Yet duty was not a burden she could escape. Her pack's survival rested upon her obedience. Days passed, and the rhythm of palace life began to reveal itself. Elara learned the rules quickly, when to speak, when to remain silent, whom to trust, and whom to avoid. Servants whispered warnings about the rival packs that watched the borders, about the nobles who plotted within the walls, and about the curse that had long shadowed the Alpha King. The curse was subtle at first. Strange movements in the halls, whispers that seemed to follow her, and objects that appeared in places she had not left them. The Alpha King spoke little of it, yet his eyes betrayed knowledge of something older and darker than any political threat. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of red and gold, Elara found herself in the palace library, shelves stretched to the ceiling stacked with ancient tomes. She ran her fingers along the spines, feeling the weight of knowledge and secrets. Some books contained the history of the pack. Others whispered of magic, curses, and battles long past. "You are drawn to knowledge," the Alpha King said from the doorway. His voice startled her, though she had begun to anticipate his presence. "Good. The mind is as important as strength, perhaps more, in our world."
Elara turned to face him.
I want to understand everything. The curse, the history, the threats.
I cannot help my pack if I do not know.
He studied her for a long moment. Then he stepped closer. Few have the courage to face what is hidden. Most fear what they do not understand. Courage will serve you well here, but so will caution. Their conversations became a strange dance of wit and observation. He tested her, sometimes cruelly, other times gently. She learned to read him as he read her, each discovering strengths and weaknesses in the other. Though he remained distant, she began to see glimpses of the man behind the title, the loneliness, the weariness, and the burden of power. One night, the palace was unusually silent. Elara wandered the halls, unable to sleep. The torches flickered, shadows stretching and twisting. She heard a faint whisper, a sound that seemed to come from nowhere. Curiosity overcame caution, and she followed it to a small chamber tucked behind the main hall. There she saw him, her Alpha King, speaking to a figure cloaked in shadow. The figure was indistinct, moving like smoke. Elara's breath caught in her throat. She could not hear the words clearly, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. The Alpha King's face was tense, his eyes hard yet desperate. She stepped back, unnoticed, and watched. The figure's hands moved as if weaving something in the air. Light shimmered briefly, casting strange patterns on the walls. The Alpha King lowered his head, nodding, agreeing to terms she could not understand. Then the figure vanished, leaving a faint chill in the air. Elara returned to her chambers, mind racing. There were things in this palace that no one had spoken of. Magic, curses, ancient powers tied to the Alpha King's bloodline. And she had seen them with her own eyes. Fear prickled at her, but so did curiosity. She knew that understanding these forces would be crucial, not only for her survival, but for the survival of her pack. The days that followed were a mixture of training, observation, and small acts of courage. She learned to move quietly through the palace, to notice when the shadows shifted unnaturally, to listen for whispers carried by the wind. She practiced skills she had never imagined needing: strategy, diplomacy, and the subtle art of influence. Meanwhile, the Alpha King continued to test her. Sometimes he asked her opinion on matters of state, watching closely as she answered. Other times he forced her into situations that challenged her physically, mentally, and emotionally. She resented him at times, fearing the power he wielded. Yet slowly, admiration and respect began to grow. One evening, they found themselves alone in the training yard. The moon was high, casting silver light over the stone walls. He handed her a wooden sword and assumed a stance. "You must learn to defend yourself," he said. "Enemies are not always at the gates. Some are closer than you think." Their practice was tense. Every move was a test, every glance a challenge. Yet as the night wore on, they began to speak. Not as Alpha and Omega, but as two people, bound by circumstance. He told her stories of battles fought long ago, of losses that had shaped him, of decisions that had haunted him. She shared her own experiences, her hopes, and her fears. In those moments, a fragile connection began to form. Not love, not yet, but understanding, respect, curiosity, and the hint of something deeper. The Alpha King, who had seemed untouchable, began to reveal his humanity, and Elara, who had feared him, began to see that strength could be gentle, and authority could carry pain as well as power. But palace life was never simple. Rival packs continued to threaten the borders. Courtiers whispered of betrayal, and servants moved like shadows, carrying messages and secrets. The curse remained, a quiet force that could not be ignored. Elara sensed it in the way the air shifted, in the faint tremor of the stone walls, in the Alpha King's rare moments of pain. Then, one night, the danger became undeniable. A messenger arrived, riding hard through the misty forest, breathless and covered in mud. He delivered a message that made the blood in Elara's veins run cold. A rival pack was moving closer, testing the Alpha King's weakened strength, threatening not just the palace, but the entire kingdom. The Alpha King read the message, his face hardening. For the first time, Elara saw pure determination mixed with fear. He turned to her, his voice steady, but low. "You have seen the shadows of this palace. You have seen the forces I guard. Now you will see the dangers that come from outside as well. Be ready. We leave at dawn." Elara's heart pounded. She had trained, observed, and learned, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of battle. She felt fear, yes, but also a strange thrill. A sense that she had begun to step into her true role, not as a pawn, but as a protector. That night, she could hardly sleep. The shadows seemed to move closer, the whispers louder. She thought of the cloaked figure, the strange magic, and the Alpha King's unwavering gaze, and she realized that the palace held more than power. It held secrets that could change the fate of the pack and of them both. As the first light of dawn broke, silver streaks across the mountains, Elara dressed quickly and followed the Alpha King to the stables. Horses stamped nervously, sensing the tension. The rival pack's approach was not just a threat, it was a challenge, a test of everything they had prepared for. The Alpha King mounted silently, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Elara climbed beside him, gripping the reins tightly. She felt the weight of history, duty, and destiny pressing upon her. She was no longer just a young girl forced into marriage. She was a part of a plan larger than herself, bound to a man whose strength and secrets could shape the future of the pack. And then, from the misty forest, came the first sound of battle, a howl, sharp and full of warning. The Alpha King's eyes narrowed, and he whispered, almost to himself, "They have come. Let us see if they know the cost of challenging this pack." Elara's heart pounded. She was ready, or as ready as anyone could be. The world outside the palace was dangerous, filled with rivalries, curses, and shadows she could barely understand. Yet, for the first time, she felt a strange certainty. She would face it. With him, and perhaps in doing so, she would discover not only courage, but something more. The forest was alive with sounds of battle, though the sun had barely risen. Elara's heart raced as the Alpha King led the charge, his horse moving swiftly through the mist. The rival pack had advanced farther than anyone expected. Shadows moved among the trees, eyes glinting like small flames in the early light. Elara gripped the reins tightly, trying to steady both herself and her thoughts. Her training in the palace had prepared her for strategy and observation, but nothing could prepare a young Omega for the reality of conflict. Yet, she felt a spark of courage, the kind that comes when responsibility is no longer a choice, but a necessity. Her pack, her people, and even the Alpha King depended on her. "Stay close," he commanded, his voice calm yet commanding. "Watch the flanks and move with me." "Do not falter," Elara nodded, though her body trembled. He had never shouted at her, never demanded more than respect and attention before. Now, the urgency in his tone was clear. They could not afford a single mistake. As they rode deeper into the forest, she noticed the rival pack waiting, partially hidden behind thick trees. Their warriors were numerous, their movements quick and sharp. The Alpha King slowed his horse, scanning the enemy with eyes that missed nothing. Even weakened, his presence was formidable, radiating authority and focus. Elara studied him closely. She saw not only strength, but also weariness, lines of pain on his face, the subtle tremor in his hand. For the first time, she understood fully the weight he carried. The pack's survival, the curse that clung to his bloodline, and his own failing body. All of it rested on his shoulders. "You will follow my lead," he said softly, almost to himself. "Courage alone will not save you. You must think, observe, and act." The clash began suddenly. Wolves leapt from the shadows, swords and daggers flashing in the dim light. Elara's instincts took over. She guided her horse skillfully, keeping pace with the Alpha King, moving to block attacks and shield those around her. Her mind raced, calculating paths, watching for danger, and protecting herself while also protecting him. He moved with grace and precision, every strike deliberate, every movement measured. Yet when a rival warrior lunged at him from the side, his strength faltered for a moment. Without thinking, Elara acted. She raised her staff, a weapon she had practiced with tirelessly, and intercepted the attack, forcing the enemy back. The Alpha King's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise passing over his face. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded at her. Respect, yes, but also recognition. She was no longer merely his forced companion. She had proven herself capable, and in that instant, a subtle bond began to form. As the battle raged, she noticed something unusual. The rival pack moved as if guided by a hidden force. Their coordination was unnatural, almost magical. Elara's mind raced. The palace had warned her about shadows and whispers, about magic and curses. Could the rival pack have its own dark power? Or was it something older, something tied to the Alpha King's curse? Her thoughts were interrupted when the Alpha King shouted, "Elara, behind you!" She turned just in time to block a sudden strike, her heart pounding. He moved beside her, striking with renewed strength, his presence like an anchor in the chaos. Together they fought with coordination that went beyond words. Each motion seemed to anticipate the other, each strike protecting the other. When the battle finally slowed, the forest lay silent, except for the heavy breaths of the survivors. Trees bore marks of conflict, and the ground was torn by hoof and paw. The rival pack had retreated, but it was clear they would return, stronger and more determined. The Alpha King dismounted, his face pale and drawn. "You saved me," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made Elara's chest tighten. "Few would dare. Fewer still would succeed." "I had to," she replied softly. "Or you, for the pack. I could not fail." He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time there was no mask of command or authority. There was only honesty and vulnerability. "You are stronger than you know," he said. Stronger than I could have imagined. Elara felt a warmth spread through her chest, an unfamiliar and slightly frightening feeling. She was beginning to understand something she had never expected. The Alpha King was not just a ruler of strength, but also a man capable of connection, of trust, and perhaps even care. In the days that followed, their bond deepened. They trained together, studied together, and planned strategies to strengthen the pack. Yet every moment was shadowed by tension. The curse that clung to the Alpha King's bloodline remained, a constant threat that could not be ignored. Elara had begun to notice subtle signs, the way his body ached after exertion, the strange shadows that seemed to follow him, and the occasional flicker of something in his eyes that was not entirely human. One evening, as they pored over maps and plans in the candlelit strategy room, he spoke of the curse. "It has haunted my family for generations," he said quietly. "It drains strength, saps life, and feeds on fear. I have tried to fight it, but the pack's survival may depend on forces beyond my control." Her fear mingled with curiosity. She had always been drawn to knowledge, to understanding the mysteries that shaped the world. Now those mysteries were at her doorstep, intertwined with the man she was slowly beginning to respect, and perhaps, in ways she did not fully understand, to care for. "Can it be broken?" she asked. He hesitated, his eyes darkening. "Possibly. But the risk is great. The one who attempts it must be strong in heart, brave in spirit, and willing to sacrifice everything." She understood the implication. If she were to help him, it would demand more than courage. It would demand trust, loyalty, and perhaps even love. But the thought of walking away was impossible. She had chosen duty once. She would not abandon it now. Their connection continued to grow, subtle, yet undeniable. He began to share glimpses of his past, of battles lost, alliances broken, and mistakes that had cost lives. She, in turn, spoke of her hopes, her fears, and the dream of protecting her pack while finding her own place in the world. In the quiet moments between strategy and training, a fragile bond formed, a thread of trust and understanding. Yet danger was never far. One night, as the palace lay quiet and shadows stretched across the halls, Elara sensed movement. She followed the feeling to a hidden corridor she had not noticed before. There, a figure cloaked in darkness moved silently, observing the Alpha King as he slept. Her heart leapt, and without thinking, she called out. The figure vanished instantly, leaving only a chill in the air. The Alpha King awoke, alert and tense, his eyes searching the shadows. "You saw it," he said, more statement than question. "I did," Elara admitted, her voice steady despite the fear tightening her chest. "Someone is watching. They know about the curse." He nodded slowly. "I feared as much. There are forces beyond rival packs, forces older and darker."
You must stay vigilant. From that night onward, Elara understood that her role was no longer passive.
She was not just an observer or a pawn. She was a protector, a partner in the battle to save the pack and the Alpha King himself. Each day brought new challenges, and each moment of danger drew them closer together, forging a bond born of shared trials, trust, and unspoken understanding. Then, one evening, as the sun set in a blaze of red and gold, the Alpha King summoned her to the highest tower. The wind howled around them, tugging at their cloaks and stirring the hair from their faces. He looked at her, his expression unreadable.
"There is a truth you must know," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. "The curse that afflicts me, it is tied to blood and bond. Only a union of hearts, strong, willing, and courageous, can hope to break it. But the process is dangerous. It may cost everything we hold dear." Elara's heart pounded. The meaning was clear. This was not just about duty or strategy. It was about trust, loyalty, and perhaps even love. She had seen the man behind the legend, had fought beside him, had felt the pull of his presence, and now the stakes were higher than she could have imagined. "I understand," she said softly. "Whatever it takes, I will face it. For the pack." Ryu!
He studied her for a long moment, the storm of wind tugging at his cloak. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. "Then we must prepare. The path ahead will not be easy, but together, perhaps we can survive it." As night fell and the castle settled into uneasy quiet, Elara stood at the edge of the tower, looking out over the misty mountains. The air was thick with anticipation and shadow. The Alpha King stepped beside her, silent but steady, and she felt the weight of the future pressing upon them both. And as the first stars appeared, glittering coldly in the night sky, a howl echoed from the distant forest, sharp, urgent, and filled with warning. Elara felt a chill of foreboding. The rival packs were only the beginning. The curse, the hidden powers, and the forces watching from the shadows were far from defeated. But for the first time, she felt something stronger than fear. She felt determination, courage, and a bond with a man she had once feared, now intertwined with hers in ways she could not yet name. They would face the darkness together. They had no choice. And in that unity there was hope, even in a world of shadows and pain. The palace trembled as the wind tore through the halls. Shadows stretched long and dark, flickering across the walls like living things. Elara gripped the Alpha King's arm, her pulse racing, her heart filled with a mix of fear and determination. The castle itself seemed alive, as if responding to the power that had awakened in its depths. "This is it," the Alpha King said, his voice low but steady. "The force behind the curse has awakened. It will test us, our strength, our courage, and our bond. Elara nodded, though her hands shook. She had fought alongside him before, defended him in battle, and faced rivals that threatened their pack. But this was different. This was not just about enemies with swords or claws. This was a force older than any pack, older than the castle itself, a darkness that fed on fear, weakness, and doubt. They moved together toward the inner sanctum of the palace, where the oldest stones hummed with power. The Alpha King opened the heavy doors, revealing a chamber that pulsed with an eerie light. Ancient symbols glowed faintly on the walls, and the air was thick with the scent of earth and old magic. Elara's eyes widened. She had seen traces of the Alpha King's curse before, glimpsed hints of it in shadows and whispers, but nothing like this. The room was alive with energy, swirling around them like mist, demanding courage and strength from anyone who entered. "Stay close," the Alpha King said. "The curse will try to divide us. It will test our trust, our hearts. If we falter, it will consume us both." Bellara took a deep breath, steeling herself.
"I won't falter," she said firmly. "I am here, and I am with you." He gave a small, almost grateful nod.
"Then let us begin." The shadows shifted suddenly, coalescing into a figure that towered above them. Its face was obscured, but its presence radiated power. It spoke, not with words, but with a voice that echoed in their minds. "Who dares enter? Who dares seek the bond that binds life and death?" Elara swallowed hard, but stepped forward. "I do," she said, her voice clear.
"I am Elara of the Omega. I face this for my pack, for the Alpha King, and for the future we must protect."
The figure regarded her, silent, testing. Then it turned to the Alpha King, whose body trembled slightly, weakness and fear evident even now. "And you, Alpha King," the entity said, "you who carry the weight of your bloodline, do you have the courage to face what has haunted you for centuries?" He straightened, his voice steady but edged with pain. "I will face it," he said, "not alone, but with her." A silence fell over the chamber. Then, slowly, the shadows receded, allowing a faint path of light to emerge in the center. The Alpha King and Elara moved together, hands brushing, hearts beating in unison. The air was charged, electric with anticipation and fear. The ritual of the curse began. Ancient symbols glowed brighter, swirling around them, weaving a pattern of light and shadow that seemed to pierce their very souls. Elara felt a pull at her heart, a test of loyalty, courage, and trust. She could feel every fear she had ever had, the weight of duty, the dread of failure, the risk of losing everything, pressing on her chest.
"You must trust me," the Alpha King whispered. "Whatever happens, whatever it shows us, we face it together."
Elara nodded, squeezing his hand. Together. The shadows surged, forming visions of their deepest fears. She saw the pack in danger, the Alpha King failing, the world collapsing into chaos. She saw herself powerless, unable to save anyone. Yet, she did not flinch. She focused on the Alpha King, on their bond, on the courage that had grown inside her since the day the Council had forced her to marry him. The Alpha King faced his own visions, enemies laughing as his strength faded, the curse consuming him, the pack falling into ruin. He saw all he had lost, all the mistakes he had made. But in the midst of fear, he felt Elara's hand on his, her presence a steady force grounding him. Step by step, breath by breath, they moved through the visions, confronting each illusion with courage, trust, and determination. The shadows screamed, twisted, and fought against them. But their bond remained unbroken. Elara's heart, strong and steadfast, illuminated the darkness. The Alpha King's strength, renewed by her courage and presence, pushed back the curse. Finally, a bright light enveloped them, and the shadows dissolved, leaving the chamber calm, serene, and filled with a warm golden glow. The curse had weakened, its power no longer absolute. The Alpha King looked at Alara, his face pale but alive with emotion. We did it, he whispered. Together, we broke part of it. Alara smiled, though exhaustion weighed on her. We faced it together. That's what mattered.
In that moment, something shifted in the Alpha King.
The weight of centuries seemed to lift slightly from his shoulders. He looked at her not as a ruler to a subject, not as a man to a woman forced into marriage, but as one soul to another. There was gratitude, respect, and something deeper, a connection forged through fire, danger, and trust. Days passed, and the palace slowly returned to normal, though the world outside remained full of challenges. The rival packs had not disappeared, but the Alpha King's renewed strength and the visible bond between him and Alara gave the pack confidence. Alara continued to train, study, and prepare, but now she did so not out of fear or obligation, but out of choice. She had found her place beside the Alpha King, not as a pawn, but as a partner, and he, for his part, began to trust her insight, her courage, and her unwavering loyalty. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and pink, the Alpha King summoned her to the balcony. The pack below moved quietly, sensing the change in leadership, sensing the unity of their rulers. "You have changed everything," he said, his voice soft, almost vulnerable. "You have given me strength I thought I had lost. You have reminded me what it means to care, to trust, and to fight, not just for myself, but for others." Alara felt a warmth spread through her chest. She had never sought to be a hero or a savior. She had only sought to protect her pack, yet in doing so, she had changed the Alpha King, and perhaps even herself.
"And you," she said gently, "have shown me that duty can be more than sacrifice. It can be courage and loyalty and
love, if one is brave enough to let it grow." He looked at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Then perhaps we are both stronger than we imagined." The days that followed were filled with rebuilding, strategy, and preparation. Alara and the Alpha King worked together, planning defenses, strengthening alliances, and quietly learning more about the remaining power of the curse. Every challenge they faced deepened their trust, and their bond became a source of hope, not only for them, but for the entire pack. At night, when the palace was quiet, they would walk the halls together, speaking softly of dreams, regrets, and plans for the future. The fear that had once held them both captive gave way to understanding and care. Each touch, each glance, carried meaning, not of obligation, but of choice. Then, one night, as the stars sparkled above the misty mountains, a whisper reached them from the forest, a faint sound, familiar and yet distant. Alara felt it in her bones, a sign that the dangers were not gone, only held at bay. The rival packs, the shadows, and the ancient forces that lingered in the world were still present. The Alpha King's hand found hers. "We cannot rest," he said quietly, "but whatever comes, we face it together."
"You are no longer just the Omega."
"You are my partner, my equal, and my strength."
Alara nodded, feeling a calm resolve she had never known.
Together they could face anything, enemies, curses, or shadows lurking in the dark. Together they had discovered courage, trust, and love. The palace stood silent, the night peaceful for the first time in centuries. And as the wind whispered through the towers, carrying the scent of pine and mist, Alara and the Alpha King stood side by side, hands clasped, hearts united. The curse had been weakened, but more importantly, they had strengthened one another. The pack would thrive, not because of fear or duty alone, but because of courage, trust, and the bond that now tied two souls together. And as the first light of dawn touched the mountains, golden and warm, Alara realized something profound. Life could be dangerous. Shadows could rise, and power could challenge them at every turn. But with courage, love, and unity, even the darkest forces could be faced. For the first time, she felt truly free, not because the world had changed, but because she had chosen her path, and chosen it with him. Together, they would protect the pack. Together, they would face whatever shadows the future held. And together, they would live, not in fear, but in hope, courage, and a bond stronger than any curse.